You can pay £80 for a set of front brake pads in this country, or you can pay 22. And on an awful lot of cars, the cheap set came out of the same press, in the same plant, with the same friction recipe in it as the expensive one. So what I'm doing today is naming 5 brands that sell in the UK at budget money and are not budget parts, with the evidence for each one, the prices you should actually be paying, and the 2 questions that tell you whether a box on a shelf is worth your money or worth nothing at all. Because here is the thing nobody at the counter is in any hurry to explain to you. Car manufacturers do not make brake pads. They buy them from a fairly short list of friction companies, and those same friction companies then sell the same compounds into the aftermarket in their own boxes at a fraction of the price, with the car maker's badge taken off. The markup you are paying is not for a better pad. It is for a name you have heard of, and a counterperson who knows you have heard of it. I have had more brake calipers off cars than I can put a number to, and the one thing you learn doing that job over and over is that the pad in the box tells you far more than the box does. Backing plate finish, chamfer, the underlayer, whether the shim is a bit of bonded paper or 3 proper laminated layers. You can read a pad in about 10 seconds once you know what you're looking at, and half the brands people sneer at read better than the ones they trust. Stay with me for number 2. Because it's a Spanish family firm turning out 22 million brake pads a year, and their own export manager once stood up in front of a room and contradicted the sales pitch that's printed on their own marketing. Number 3 is a British brand that had to invent its own test, because the legal one doesn't measure how long a brake pad lasts. And number 5 is the one that will properly annoy you. A name almost nobody in Britain asks for by name, which happens to own the company that makes the famous German-badged pads sitting on the shelf above it. Then, at the end, I'll show you what the approval mark on the box is actually worth, and what happened when our own regulator went out and bought 8 brands off the shelf and put them on a dynamometer. 3 of them failed. Let's get into it. Here's the frame for the whole list, and it's the only bit of theory you need. There are 2 things in play: who baked the pad and who printed the box. They are very often not the same company, and the gap between those 2 facts is where all the money in this business is made. A brake pad is closer to a cake than a casting. Dozens of dry and wet ingredients get weighed out, steel fibres go in, the lot gets mixed and then pressed, cold or hot depending on the recipe, into a shape bonded onto a steel backing plate. Then it's cured in an oven, ground flat, sometimes scorched on the surface so it beds in quicker, and finished with grooves, chamfers, shims and paint. Every one of those steps is a decision, and every decision costs money. The friction material itself is a formulation somebody spent months developing and will not tell you the details of. Now, there are only a few dozen companies on Earth that can actually do all that at scale and to a repeatable standard. There are hundreds of brands. Do that arithmetic, and you land exactly where I'm about to take you. Some of the cheapest boxes in a British motor factor are filled by some of the biggest friction plants in the world. Right. Number 1. Mintex. The brand your dad probably used, that the internet has quietly decided is second rate, and that is made in a factory in Hartlepool by a company called TMD Friction. TMD is not a minor outfit. It is a wholly owned subsidiary of Nisshinbo Holdings of Japan. It runs plants across Europe, the Middle East, the United States, Brazil, Mexico and China, and it describes its workforce as more than 3,900 friction specialists. Its brand list is the interesting part. Textar, Pagid, Don Cobrec, Bendix and Mintex. One company, one research operation, which by its own account runs to something in the region of 30 million euros a year, and 6 labels sitting at different price points in different markets. The trade tiering roughly goes like this. Textar is the premium badge with near total vehicle coverage. Pagid sits in the middle and turns up as original fitment on a great many Volkswagen Group cars and on things like the Mercedes Vito, and Mintex is the value tier. That's the marketing ladder. Here's what I'd say about it. And I want to be clear, this is my read rather than a documented fact. A marketing ladder is a pricing decision, not a friction quality ladder. The compounds are different genuinely. A pad developed for a 2-ton executive saloon is not the pad for a Fiesta, but they come out of the same materials science, the same test benches, the same quality system, and in the UK, largely the same site. In April 2026, TMD relaunched Mintex with new packaging, copper-free and antimony-free friction formulations, and a fully coated disc range. Coated discs matter more in Britain than almost anywhere because our winters are wet and salted, and an uncoated disc will have a rust ring around the hub face and the outer edge before you've finished the running in. Money. Across the online factors, Mintex pad sets run from roughly £19 up to about £58, depending on the car and the fitment. For a mainstream family hatchback, you're in the low to mid-20s. Now compare that with the garage bill. Checkatrade puts front pad replacement in the UK at around £105 to £135 all in. The RAC's average sits at about £127, and if you take a German badge to a franchise dealer, the same job climbs a long way past that. By the way, if you want to keep your car running for as long as possible without wasting money on unnecessary garage bills, I put together a guide called the 500k Mile Car Care Bible. It covers 101 habits that can help your car last longer, the warning signs you should never ignore, and how to spot unnecessary repairs and garage upsells before they cost you a fortune. To get your copy, just scan the QR code on screen with your phone's camera, or use the first pinned comment below. The bit I like about Mintex that has nothing to do with price. The fitment data is good. Coverage matters more than people realise, because the commonest brake job failure isn't a bad pad, it's the wrong pad. A set that's 4 millimeters too short on the backing plate, rattling in a carrier it was never designed for, wearing on a taper from day one. So that's the biggest friction group in Europe, selling you its own product with the premium badge taken off. Number 2 is stranger, because the company doesn't really want to tell you what it is. Icer Brakes. Spanish, family run, founded in 1961, headquarters in Pamplona, plant at Tudela, and by their own numbers, more than 22 million units a year, going out to over 70 countries. And here is the claim that everybody quotes. Icer say that if your brake pads are marked made in Spain, they very probably came out of an Icer factory. They describe themselves as a Tier 1 and Tier 2 supplier to European car makers and say their private label pads are sold worldwide as original equipment. Right. Loop paid and paid honestly, because this is where it gets awkward and I'm not going to smooth it over. At a press event some years back, Icer's own export manager was asked about exactly this and said something a marketing department would never have written. That they are not an OE manufacturer, they are an OES second brand, and that they manufacture for companies such as Renault under those companies' own labels. Those two statements do not sit comfortably together. The Amazon listings shout original equipment. The man from the company says second brand. My read, flagged as a read, not a fact, is that the truth is the boring middle. A plant that size, making an entire range for a car maker's own brand parts program, is doing genuine original equipment standard work under someone else's name, and is not the design partner who homologated the brake system when the car was drawn. Both things are true at once. What I can't do is tell you which specific models roll off a Spanish line with Icer material in them, because those supply contracts are not public. And anyone on the internet who tells you they know the full list is guessing. What I can tell you is what the product is like in the hand. Copper-free formulations, no heavy metals, accessories in the box rather than sold separately, and a range that now includes pads developed specifically for electric cars, and a long life range aimed at last-mile delivery vans, which is a properly telling detail because delivery fleets buy on cost per 1,000 miles and nothing else. A brand that will sell into that market has to be able to prove wear life to a buyer with a spreadsheet. Icer sells in the UK for money that makes people suspicious. On common European fitments, you'll see sets in the 20s. Fit them, bed them in properly, and the thing you notice is how little they dust, which for anyone running alloys they actually clean is worth more than most people admit. That's the invisible giant. Number 3 is the opposite. A British brand you'll see everywhere that people are weirdly rude about, and that went and built extra tests because the legal one wasn't enough. Comline. British company, and their brake pad range is the core of the business. Over 800 references covering popular European, Japanese and Korean cars and light vans, all of it approved to the European regulation. They say every pad is made in their own production facility, which gives them control over materials, specification and process. I'll be straight with you. I have not been able to independently confirm where that facility is, and that is their statement, rather than something I've verified, so take it as such. Here's the part that earns them the place, and here's the loop I flagged. The legal approval standard for replacement brake friction in this country, you'll see it as R90 on the box, does not test how long a pad lasts. It doesn't test noise either. That's not me being cynical. That's the plain position of the trade. A brake specialist put it exactly that way in the industry press, that R90 does not test for longevity or noise, which is why serious makers go beyond it. So Comline built their own additional procedures on top, hot shear testing, wear analysis and noise testing, and market the result as R90+. Think about what that tells you. A brand people dismiss as cheap tat is voluntarily paying for tests the law does not require on the 2 attributes the law happens to ignore, which are also the 2 attributes you will personally notice: whether they last and whether they squeal. They also went copper-free before anyone made them. Copper particles off brake pads got the blame in California for damage to marine ecosystems. There's no European law forcing it out, and Comline took it out anyway, with a hazardous materials rating confirming less than 0.5% copper by weight. In their case, 0. Now the honest caveat, because I'm not selling anything, and this list is worthless if I only give you the good half. Comline's public reviews are split. Plenty of people report quiet, smooth, no scoring, delighted for the money. And there are people reporting squeal and marked discs on the same range. My experience of that pattern across every brand at this price point is that it's usually fitment and process rather than compound. Old shims reused, carrier slides seized, hub face not cleaned back to bare metal, no bedding in. But I can't prove that for every case. And if 3 people tell you a set squealed, something squealed, let's stop and take stock, because you've now seen enough to spot the shape of it. Every brand so far has been the same story told 3 ways: an enormous manufacturing operation, a modest name on the box, and a price that has nothing to do with what's inside. That's the pattern. From here, it changes and it escalates. The next 2 are not just cheap pads from big factories. They are cases where the budget name and the premium name are corporately the same entity. And the 4th one is deliberately going to be the shortest thing I say today. Number 5 is still outstanding, and it's the one that flips this entire list on its head. Number 4, Delphi. Short, and short on purpose. Delphi Technologies is a BorgWarner brand now, and it has one of the widest braking catalogues in Europe. A Techalliance report put it top for brake pad coverage in the EU at over 99.5% of vehicles on the road, and they're routinely first to market on new applications, which is why your local factor can get pads for a car that's barely out of warranty. Coated discs, OE-configured chamfers, accessories in the box. There is no scandal here, no hidden ownership twist, no story. It's a giant OE supplier selling proper parts at ordinary aftermarket money. And I've fitted a lot of them and thought about them afterwards. Exactly never. That's the compliment. Quick word before the last one. If this has been useful and you'd like more of it, subscribing is the whole ask. No bargaining, no speech. Now, number 5, and the reason I made you wait. Nisshinbo, Japanese. And the group has been making friction products since 1946. They've been Mazda's original equipment brake supplier for decades, half a century by one account, and their pads and linings are fitted to hundreds of different models around the world. And Nisshinbo Holdings is the owner of TMD Friction. Outright, which means the Japanese name that almost no British motorist walks into a factor and asks for by name, is the parent company of Textar, Pagid, Mintex, Don, Kobrek and Bendix. The whole German premium shelf and the value shelf underneath it, and the brand at number 1 on this list, all sit inside the group whose own badge is the one nobody's heard of. I find that genuinely funny. And it's the cleanest possible illustration of the point I've been making for the last 20 minutes. The hierarchy in your head, German premium, British mid, Japanese unknown, is a marketing artifact. The corporate reality runs in almost exactly the opposite direction. Practically, Nisshinbo badged pads are aimed squarely at Asian markers, and that's where I'd use them. Toyota, Mazda, Honda, Nissan, the Korean stuff. The friction is developed against the design conventions those manufacturers use, and if you've ever fitted a European recipe pad to a Japanese car and lived with a slightly dead first application on a cold morning, you'll know why that matters. The honest problem is availability. In the UK, you'll find them online and through some factors, but you cannot walk into every shop and get them next morning the way you can with APEC or Borg and Beck or Blueprint. If you need the car by Tuesday, that's a real constraint, and no amount of corporate trivia fixes it. Now, the bit you came for, there is a mark on every legal replacement brake pad box in this country. R90. It is presented to you by retailers, by factors, by brands, as proof that what you're buying performs like the part your car left the factory with. Read the packaging, read the listings. That is the promise being made to you, and it is not quite the promise being kept. What R90 actually does is compare the replacement's friction behaviour against the original part and require it to land within 15% at set pressures on a dynamometer, dry, at gross vehicle weight. The whole friction test takes something like 3 to 5 hours. Original equipment development, by contrast, can run 6 months and covers wet performance, temperature sensitivity, wear, fade, thermal conductivity, judder, durability and noise, the things R90 might never look at. Approval is granted per friction compound, tested on the most demanding vehicle in a family, and then extended across all the part numbers using that compound on vehicles of equal or lesser severity. So sit with that 15% for a second. Somebody sat in a room and decided how far a replacement could deviate from your car's original braking and still be sold to you as equivalent. That number was negotiated by the industry that makes and sells brake pads. You weren't asked. Nobody polled a single driver in Britain on how much of their braking they'd like to donate to the aftermarket, and the window isn't disclosed to you anywhere on the box. The box just says approved. And then it gets worse, because in 2022, the DVSA's market surveillance unit did the obvious thing. They took a registration number, selected the correct components for that car, bought 8 different brands of aftermarket brake pads, and tested them. 3 of the 8 failed the performance requirements, and the paperwork behind those 3 was false. The parts and their packaging carried an approval number that wasn't valid for that application. The 3 brands were instructed to withdraw them from sale, and the DVSA declined to name them while investigations were ongoing. One note on that: because sources disagree, the trade press reported it in spring 2022, and at least one major manufacturer's own article refers to it as a 2023 investigation. I've taken the earlier date because that's where the primary trade reporting sits, and to my knowledge, those 3 brands have never been publicly named, so you cannot avoid them by name, only by principle. 3 and 8, on the one component in your car that has no backup, no limp home mode, no second attempt. And the mark that was supposed to be your protection was, in those cases, ink. Nobody plotted this. It's just commercial gravity. Printing a mark costs nothing. Getting a compound properly approved costs 4 to 6 months and real money. The counter staff can't test a pad, and neither can you. The shopper compares 2 boxes that both say approved and buys the cheaper one, and the incentive to lie is enormous, while the chance of being caught is a government unit that can only test a handful of samples a year. So the standard drifts down to whatever the paperwork can be made to say, which is why you now stop buying the word approved and start buying the manufacturer. That's the whole defence, and it's why this list exists. A friction company with its own plants, its own approvals, and a reputation across 6 brands cannot afford to fake a certificate. A label with no factory behind it can afford almost nothing else. Something I keep coming back to, doing this work. The skill worth having is not knowing brands. Brands change hands, get bought, get moved down a tier, get relaunched with new packaging in April. The skill is being able to look at a thing and work out what it actually is, who made it, what it cost to make, which corners are cheap to cut and whether they've been cut here. It's a form of literacy, and it transfers. Learn it on brake pads and you'll use it on boilers, on batteries, on ladders, on the quote a builder just handed you. And it is completely learnable. Nobody is born knowing that a laminated shim is 3 layers and a nasty one is a bit of bonded paper. Somebody told me in a cold workshop, holding one of each. That's how all of this moves, sideways between people for free. And it's the only reason any of us can tell a real thing from a story about a real thing. The industry would much rather you outsourced that judgment to a logo. Don't. So here's how to buy brake pads in Britain without being taken for a ride. Run it as a procedure in this order. 1. Find out who made your car's originals. Take the old pad off and look. The friction code, and often the maker's mark, are on the backing plate or the edge. Failing that, look at what fell out of the box last time. Or ask your factor to run the fitment off the registration and tell you which brands share the same original supplier. Now buy that supplier's own brand box. That's the entire trick. 2. Inspect before you fit. Sealed box. A unique part number, an approval mark, something traceable. A batch number, a date, a source code, fitting instructions in English. If the box is bare, if there's no batch marking, if the listing is a generic photo and a brand you can't find a factory for, walk away and lose the £8 you saved. 3. Price it per axle, not per pad, and price the whole job. A quality branded front set for a small car sits somewhere around £8 to £20 for a Golf or a Focus. Roughly 12 to 35 for a big premium SUV, 25 to 70 and up. Parts for the fronts on a typical family car from a factor come to about £40 to £90 against a garage bill of around £100 to £170 for the same work. That difference is the labour, and labour is worth paying for when the job needs it. 4. Decide honestly whether it's your job. Front pads on an older car with the right tools. Trolley jack, axle stands, torque wrench, a couple of hours, is a reasonable Saturday. Rears on most things built since about 2015 are not, because the electronic parking brake motor has to be wound back into service mode with a diagnostic tool, and without it, the piston will not retract, and the new pads will not go in. A tool that can do it starts around £60, and some manufacturers want their own software. If you're under warranty, or the car's got an electronic handbrake and you haven't got the kit, hand it over. That's not defeat. That's arithmetic. 5. Do the job properly, or the best pads in the world will squeal at you. Hub face, cleaned back to bare metal. Slides cleaned and greased with the correct grease, never on the friction surface. New fitting kit if the old clips are tired. Torque everything to spec rather than to feel. And bed them in. A few hundred gentle to moderate stops from moderate speed, no dragging, no sitting on the pedal at a standstill with them hot, and no hard braking for the first 100 miles or so. 6. Know the threshold. Under 1.5 millimeters of friction material is an MOT failure, not an advisory. Between 1.5 and 3, you'll typically get an advisory, and a pad that took 2 years to go from 10 millimeters to 3 can go from 3 to the limit inside a couple of months, because wear accelerates as the material thins. Front brakes do the majority of the work, so they go first. Check them when the wheels are off for tyres. It costs nothing, and it's the difference between a pad job and a pad and disc job. Get all that right with any of the 5 brands above, and here's what you actually get. Nothing. No grinding on a cold morning, no advisory next MOT, no phone call from a garage about how the discs have gone as well now. Just a bill that never turns up over and over for years, which is the quietest and most underrated form of being well off. One thread I've deliberately left hanging, and I'll come back to it. Europe has just started regulating brake dust itself, a limit on particulate mass from the brakes, applying to newly type-approved cars from the end of November 2026, with a tighter figure, again for battery electric cars, and tighter still in the next decade. That is going to change what's in these compounds, and it will change them for us too, because these are the same factories. What I don't know is exactly how Britain will handle it on our side of the channel, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise until I've got something solid. Now, you. What I want in the comments is your actual mileage, brand, car, and how many miles you got out of a set, and whether they were quiet doing it. Not what you've read, what you fitted with your own hands. That's the only data any of us have that isn't somebody's marketing, and there are people reading this who are about to spend 150 quid at a fast fit on Saturday morning and would love to know what you know. Tell me where in the country you are too. Salt, hills and city driving turn the same set of pads into completely different stories, and a Yorkshire answer and a Cornwall answer are not the same answer. And if you're in the trade and I've got something wrong, a tier, an ownership, a plant, come and say so plainly. I'd rather be corrected than repeated. I read the replies on these, all of them, and the good ones end up shaping what I look into next. Look after your brakes and don't pay for the badge.